Okay, let's work on the endpoint for this particular request, which is going to make a post request to our auction API URL, API auctions, and it's going to accept the properties that we send up inside what effectively is the create auction DTO that we added earlier. So let's head back to VS Code and implement this functionality. So we need an HTTP post type of request for this. And we don't need to specify any parameters for this because our framework is smart enough to realize that if a post request comes into this route, then this is an HTTP GET request, so is this, and as long as we've only got one HTTP post request at this route, then this is the method that's going to be executed. So we're going to say public async task, and let's give the IntelliCode a go just by tabbing because it looks like it's written almost exactly what I want it to, and I can tab my way through, and wow, that saves a bit of time. Good job, artificial intelligence. And we'll call this method create auction here, and we do need some parameters for this. We need a create auction DTO, and I'll just call it auction DTO. And the first thing we need to do here is map the auction or create auction DTO into an auction entity. So we can use AutoMapper for that. So we'll say var auction equals mapper.map, and then we specify what we want to map into. So this is going to be auction to represent the auction entity, and we can pass it the auction DTO. And looks like I haven't imported this yet, so I'll just add the quick fix and say using auction services entities. Now at this point, what we would want to do is check the username of the user that's creating this auction, because we wouldn't want anonymous users to be able to create an auction, but we haven't added identity yet, so we're not working with usernames and authentication yet. So I'm just going to add a to-do and say add current user as seller. But in the meantime, just so that we have something, I'm going to say auction seller equals and just specify test as a placeholder for the time being. Following this, we can then add the auction using Entity Framework. So I'm going to say context auctions.add, and then we can pass the auction. And what's happening here is Entity Framework is effectively tracking this in memory. So nothing's been saved to the database at this point. This is simply being added to memory, and Entity Framework is tracking this because it is an entity. Following this, we can actually save this to the database. So we're going to say var result equals await, and then we'll use context and save changes async, and we'll say greater than 0 because this save changes async method returns an integer for each change it was able to save in a database. If it returns 0, that means nothing was saved into our database, and we know our result is going to be false. But if the changes were more than 0, then we can presume that was successful, and this will evaluate to true. So we'll check the results, and we'll say if exclamation mark is result, then we'll simply return a bad request, and we'll say could not save changes to the DB, and don't want result there. Okay, that IntelliCode thing could be annoying at some point because it seems to be adding extra bits that I don't need in the code. So I guess it's a pros and cons thing. Does it really save time? We'll find out. And what we want to return from a post request is what we should return is an HTTP with a status code of 201 created to say that we've created a resource, and we also need to tell the client where the resource was created at. So we have a method inside here that we can use to do such a thing, and what we'll return is a created at action, and we can specify the name of the action where this resource can be found. So in this case, we've got a method here called getAuctionById, and this is the location we would want to send back in the header to tell the client that, hey, yes, we've created your resource, and this is the location you can get your resource. So this particular endpoint is where we'd want them to know about if they wanted to get the resource that's been created. So we can specify name of and get auction by ID, And this particular method, this takes an argument of the GUID of the auction. So we can specify as a second parameter in the created@action, we can specify new, and then we can simply specify the auction ID as the parameter that's needed for this particular action or endpoint. And then as a third parameter, we can return the auction DTO. So in order to return an auction DTO from this, we need to go from our auction entity into an auction DTO. So once again, we'll utilize mapper functionality for this, and we'll map into an auction DTO from the auction. And that should all be good. And let's take a look. And just missing the semicolon at the end. So that's our endpoint for creating an auction. And now we can go test in Postman. So let's go take a look. In fact, let's just open up the terminal and see what's going on inside here. Hot reload makes a bit of a mess inside your console because when I forgot to add a semicolon, it prints out this nasty warning. But it does say at the end there, hot reload of changes did succeed. So let's give that a go. And we'll head over to Postman and we'll see if we can actually create an auction from this particular request. So we've got our make, the model, the color, the year, the mileage. And if I, just to test the validation is working correctly, if I remove one of these properties, the color for instance, that is a required property. And if we do not provide a color, what we should expect to find is that based on what we have inside our create auction DTO, if I miss the color, which is a required property, what we should see is a bad request. And the reason that we should see it's a bad request is because of what we've done in the auctions controller. Where we've got the API controller, this is responsible for checking validation, and if it doesn't meet the validation requirements, then it's not even going to let the request get to this endpoint. The framework is going to reject the request before it gets to the endpoint that we're asking for. So let's see if that functionality works first of all as a simple test. So I've removed the color, and if I click send, then what we get is a 400 bad request, and it tells us that the color field is required. So that functionality is working, which is good. And if I put the color back in again, then this time we should meet the validation requirements and the auction should be created and everything should be okay. So let's click send. We get a successful response. We get the auction back from the endpoint or the auction DTO. We can see that we've got the status of 201 created. And if we take a look at the headers, because it is a 201 created, what we also get is a location header in the response that tells us the location of what has been created. And we can see that there in this particular response, which is good. And we can also see the test results are passing with the status code of 201 and the response body contains the expected properties. So if you use different property names for the auction, then please do take a look in here and take a look at what's expected. And if you did want to use different property names, that's fine, of course, but you would need to update the test to reflect the properties that you're expected to get back, or simply remove the test that contains these properties. Either way is fine, but it's only a Postman test and it's not going to affect your application anyway. But now we have the ability to create a new auction. Our next task is to take a look at updating the created auction, or any auction, and we'll take a look at that next.